Van Helsing.
You cannot hide from me.
Cold reveals what warmth hides.
Why can't you tell the world I work for you?
We must keep moving.
Is to vanquish evil.
We are not so different, are we? Nightmares come to life.
Count Dracula.
We have no time to lose.
For 100 years, I'd say that's earned him a drink.
Van Helsing. Van Helsing.
We must be careful with this. We have no time to lose.
This ends now.
We must keep moving.
This ends now. I will not falter now.
I'll never let go.
We are bound by ancient oaths. We are bound by ancient oaths.
The cold reveals what warmth hides.
I've seen enough storms to know they never truly end.
For honor and glory!
The light is perfect right now.
Aim steady. We have one shot.
Focus on the target. Do not hesitate.
They're watching us. Then let them watch.
For honor and glory! You cannot hide from me.
We are not safe here.
We must be careful with this. We have no time to lose.
This ends now.
We must keep moving.
This ends now. I will not falter now.
I'll never let go.
We are bound by ancient oaths. We are bound by ancient oaths.
The cold reveals what warmth hides.
I've seen enough storms to know they never truly end.
For honor and glory!
The light is perfect right now.
Aim steady. We have one shot.
Focus on the target. Do not hesitate.
They're watching us. Then let them watch.
For honor and glory! You cannot hide from me.
We are not safe here.
We do not falter now.
Stay behind me.
Watch your step.
I won't be broken!
I'm still here.
We cannot wait any longer.
We must reach the throne before dawn.
see what you mean.
You cannot hide from me.
We must be ready for what comes next.
Stay back.
The cold reveals what warmth hides.
We do not falter now.
Stay behind me.
Watch your step.
I won't be broken!
I'm still here.
We cannot wait any longer.
We must reach the throne before dawn.
I see what you mean.
You cannot hide from me.
We must be ready for what comes next.
Stay back.
The cold reveals what warmth hides.
There are some movies that begin by asking you to believe in one impossible thing. Van Helsing begins by asking you to believe in almost everything at once. Before the story has even found its footing, the film has already opened the door to a world where Dracula is real. Frankenstein's monster exists. Werewolves stalk the night. Vampires reproduce like an army. Ancient families carry supernatural obligations across generations. And somewhere behind all of it stands a mysterious hunter working for an even more mysterious institution. It is not trying to quietly revive the old monsters. It wants to throw them onto the same battlefield and see what happens. That ambition is the first thing worth understanding about Van Helsing, because without it, the movie can easily look like an overstuffed collection of gothic cliches, elaborate costumes, computer-generated creatures and explosions. But the strange thing about the film is that its excess is not accidental. Excess is practically its creative philosophy. Stephen Sommers, coming off the enormous success of The Mummy and The Mummy Returns, approached the classic monster tradition not as a museum piece, but as raw material for a giant adventure movie. Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the Wolfman had already become cultural icons long before this film arrived. Sommers' idea was essentially to take those icons, place them inside one mythology, give them a new action-oriented environment, and build a hero capable of moving between all of them. And that hero is not quite the Van Helsing that audiences might expect. The name belongs to Bram Stoker's Dracula, but the man we meet here is something much more modern. He carries a crossbow, uses firearms, fights with blades, knows how to kill supernatural creatures, works for the Vatican, travels with specialized equipment, and walks into situations that would send an ordinary 19th century man running in the opposite direction. There is something almost like a secret agent about him, except that his world is filled with castles instead of spy headquarters and monsters instead of international criminals. He is a gothic adventurer filtered through the physical language of the early 2000s action hero. Hugh Jackman is perfectly suited to that transformation. By 2004, audiences already knew him as Wolverine, but Van Helsing gives him a different kind of physical presence. He is not playing a superhero, yet the movie treats him with the same kind of cinematic confidence. Van Helsing enters a room as though the room has already been warned about him. His movements are controlled, his reactions are quick, and even when he does not understand what is happening, he rarely appears helpless. The mystery is not whether he can fight. The mystery is why he seems to know how to fight monsters so naturally. That question becomes important almost immediately, because Van Helsing is built around mysteries of identity as much as it is built around monsters. The film opens not in Transylvania, and not with the hero, but in a world of black and white gothic horror that deliberately feels as though it has escaped from another era of cinema. Thunder rolls across the sky. A storm surrounds Castle Frankenstein. Inside, a scientist is preparing to do what humanity has repeatedly been warned not to do: create life. Victor Frankenstein is not portrayed here as a purely philosophical figure. He is a man consumed by experimentation, and his laboratory is an enormous theatrical nightmare of machinery, electricity, and strange apparatus. The film immediately establishes one of its central ideas. Science and superstition are not opposites in this universe. They exist side by side. Electricity can animate a corpse. Ancient curses can transform a man into a wolf. Holy water can destroy supernatural creatures. A scientist can pursue an impossible dream while a mob outside prepares to burn his castle. The visual language is intentionally old-fashioned. Lightning flashes through enormous laboratory windows. Machinery clanks and sparks. Shadows stretch across stone walls. The villagers outside are angry, frightened, and convinced that something unnatural has been created. The sequence could almost be mistaken for a tribute to the universal Frankenstein tradition, except that the scale is much larger and the camera moves with the energy of a modern blockbuster. Then the experiment succeeds. The monster awakens, and before the audience has time to understand what has happened, another figure enters the story: Count Dracula. This is where Van Helsing makes its first major departure from the familiar versions of these stories. Dracula is not merely a vampire haunting Transylvania or seducing victims from a dark castle. He is connected directly to Frankenstein's experiment because he sees something in the monster that goes far beyond scientific curiosity. The creature is alive, and that makes him useful. Dracula wants children. Not metaphorical children, not heirs in the traditional sense. He wants an army of offspring. That immediately changes the nature of his obsession. This Dracula is not simply interested in blood, domination, or immortality. He has already achieved immortality. His problem is that his vampires cannot produce life in the ordinary way. His existence is therefore strangely sterile. He can destroy human beings, but he cannot naturally create a living generation of his own. Frankenstein's monster offers him a solution. That idea gives the entire film an unexpectedly disturbing foundation. Dracula has conquered death, but immortality has not given him everything he wants. He can live forever, yet he cannot reproduce. The monster, meanwhile, represents the opposite scientific miracle, a being who has been brought into existence artificially. Dracula sees in that miracle the possibility of solving his own biological limitation, and this is where the film's obsession with defeating death begins to take shape. Victor Frankenstein wants to create life. Dracula wants to use that creation to manufacture life of his own. The monster simply wants to remain alive. Those three desires are connected, but morally they are very different. The The villagers do not care about those distinctions. They see the monster as an abomination, and their fear becomes a mob. Frankenstein tries to protect his creation, but the situation collapses into violence. The castle is attacked. Fire spreads. Frankenstein's dream becomes a nightmare almost as quickly as it becomes a scientific achievement. The monster survives, but Frankenstein does not, and Dracula gets what he wants, or at least part of it. This opening is important because the film has already established that the monsters are not all interchangeable. Dracula is powerful, intelligent, and calculating. Frankenstein's monster is physically terrifying but emotionally vulnerable. Frankenstein himself is ambitious and perhaps reckless, but his ambition comes from a desire to discover something humanity has never possessed. The monster is therefore born into a world that has already decided he is a monster. That becomes one of the most important emotional ideas in the entire movie. When we eventually encounter him again, he is not introduced as a villain. He is hunted. He is frightened. He is confused. His physical appearance may be enormous and intimidating, but the film gives him something that many versions of the creature depend upon: innocence. Shula Hensley's performance is particularly important here because so much of the character has to be communicated without conventional dialogue. The monster's body becomes part of the performance. His posture, movements and facial expressions reveal fear and uncertainty. He can look threatening while simultaneously appearing like someone who does not understand why everyone wants to hurt him. That contradiction is exactly what makes him work. The audience is introduced to him as a creature created by unnatural science, but the deeper question is whether being created unnaturally makes someone evil. The film never develops that philosophical question as deeply as a serious Frankenstein adaptation might, but it keeps returning to the emotional consequence. The monster did not choose to exist, and that makes him different from Dracula. Dracula chose his existence, chose his power, and repeatedly chooses what to do with it. The monster simply wants to survive. The opening eventually gives way to another world entirely, and the contrast is deliberate. We leave Frankenstein's laboratory behind and enter the world of the Vatican. If the opening castle represents forbidden science, the Vatican represents an entirely different form of knowledge. But this is not a solemn, historically realistic Vatican. This is Van Helsing's Vatican, a secretive organization filled with ancient knowledge, supernatural intelligence, and surprisingly advanced equipment. Religious symbols exist beside machinery. Sacred objects sit alongside weapons. The institution understands monsters, knows their weaknesses, and has apparently been fighting supernatural threats for generations. And somewhere inside this strange world is Van Helsing. He is sent on a mission. The assignment takes him to Transylvania, where the Valerious family has been fighting Dracula for generations. The reason for the mission is not simply that Dracula is dangerous. The Valerious family carries an old promise. Their ancestor vowed that the family would not enter heaven until Dracula was destroyed. Generation after generation has therefore inherited the responsibility. It is a burden that has become almost impossible to separate from the family's identity. By the time Van Helsing arrives, that history has become personal. Anna Valerious is the last surviving member of the family. Her brother Velkan is believed to be dead. Her father is gone. Her family has been fighting Dracula for years, and Dracula is still there. Kate Beckinsale's Anna is introduced as someone who has already spent too much of her life waiting for the next attack. She is not simply standing in a castle waiting for a hero to rescue her. She has her own weapons, her own knowledge, and her own reasons for fighting. She is carrying the weight of a family obligation that existed long before Van Helsing arrived. That distinction matters. Anna is certainly placed within the tradition of the Gothic heroine, but the film gives her a much more active physical role than the stereotypical damsel in distress. She rides, shoots, fights, and takes risks. She knows the local threat better than Van Helsing does. He may be the professional monster hunter, but this is her world. Their relationship therefore begins not with instant romance, but with friction. Van Helsing arrives as an outsider. Anna does not automatically trust him. Why should she? Men have been sent to fight Dracula before. Families have died before. Promises have been made before. The supernatural has already taken almost everything she has. And Van Helsing himself is hardly reassuring. He arrives with a mysterious past, an unexplained connection to the Vatican, and an attitude suggesting that he has encountered horrors before that he is not willing to discuss. This is one of the cleverer aspects of Hugh Jackman's performance. He does not play Van Helsing as a man who constantly announces his own importance. Instead, the character often behaves as though he has already seen things that the audience has not. His competence creates curiosity. What exactly has this man done before? Why does the Vatican trust him with these missions? Why does he seem so comfortable walking into supernatural danger? And why does Dracula appear to recognize something about him? The movie keeps those questions alive. Then comes Carl. David Wenham's Carl could easily have been nothing more than comic relief, and there are certainly moments when the film uses him that way. But he is more useful than that. He provides the intellectual and technological counterweight to Van Helsing's physicality. Van Helsing can shoot. Carl can explain what they are shooting at. Van Helsing can improvise in a fight. Carl can provide the equipment that makes the fight possible. He understands religious lore, supernatural weaknesses, and the practical mechanics of monster hunting. His inventions also allow the movie to turn the 19th century setting into something closer to a fantasy adventure world. That combination is central to the film's identity. Van Helsing looks backward toward classic monster movies, but it moves forward with the speed of a modern action blockbuster. That becomes obvious the moment the story truly begins to unfold in Transylvania. The landscape is cold, dark, and isolated. Villages sit beneath enormous mountains. Forests seem to hide something beyond the edge of civilization. Castles rise from the darkness like impossible structures from a nightmare. Lightning turns the landscape into a series of sudden images. Stone towers, crooked branches, distant silhouettes. This is not historical Transylvania. It is a cinematic Transylvania. The film is not asking the audience to believe that this is exactly what 19th century Eastern Europe looked like. It wants the audience to believe that this is what 19th century Eastern Europe feels like in a monster story.
We are bound
and that distinction
by ancient
explains much of the production design. Everything is heightened.
We
The
are
castles
bound by
are
ancient
enormous.
oaths.
The laboratories are theatrical. The costumes are elaborate. The weapons look like they were designed by someone who had no interest in whether an ordinary person would actually carry them. Van Helsing's crossbow is not just a weapon. It is part of his identity. His guns, ammunition, and monster-killing equipment make him feel like a supernatural gunslinger. Even the way he carries himself contributes to the impression that this is not an ordinary man dropped into a Gothic story. The Gothic story has been redesigned around him. Then the vampires attack, and suddenly the movie's scale expands. What initially looked like a local battle between one family and one vampire becomes something much larger. Dracula has an army. His brides move through the night with predatory speed and theatrical elegance. They are beautiful, monstrous, and dangerous, embodying one of the film's favorite contradictions. elegance sitting directly beside grotesque horror. The Vampire Brides also show how strongly Van Helsing belongs to the visual culture of early 2000s fantasy cinema. Their costumes are designed to be immediately recognizable. Their movements are enhanced by visual effects. Their appearances are exaggerated rather than naturalistic. The film does not want subtle vampires. It wants vampires who announce themselves. And then the audience begins to understand the scale of Dracula's plan. Frankenstein's monster is not merely a trophy. He is the missing component. Dracula needs the monster because his own offspring cannot survive in the ordinary way. They are born dependent upon an artificial process. Without Frankenstein's scientific knowledge, or more accurately, without the monster's unique biological existence, Dracula's enormous plans for reproduction remain incomplete. This also explains why the monster becomes the center of the conflict. Everyone wants him. Dracula wants him alive. The Vatican wants him protected. Anna wants to prevent Dracula from using him. And the monster himself wants nothing more complicated than to escape. That is a surprisingly effective setup, because the monster becomes a person being fought over, rather than simply another creature to defeat. Meanwhile, Anna's family tragedy becomes even more complicated when the truth about Velkan begins to emerge. Velkan has not simply disappeared. He has been transformed. The werewolf curse has taken him. And this introduces a completely different kind of monster into the story. The vampire is seductive. The Frankenstein monster is tragic. The werewolf is transformation. Velkan's horror comes from the fact that the creature and the human being are the same person. He is not merely hunted by a monster. He is becoming one. The transformation therefore has emotional stakes before it ever becomes an action spectacle. Anna has spent her life protecting her family. Now her brother has become one of the things she has been trained to destroy. That is the kind of cruel contradiction Van Helsing repeatedly builds into its story. The monsters are not always strangers. Sometimes the monster is the person you were trying to save. The werewolf mythology also provides one of the film's most important rules. Silver can kill the creature. This rule is simple, but it becomes increasingly important as the story develops, because Van Helsing is fundamentally a movie about rules. The supernatural world may be exaggerated, but the creatures have weaknesses. Vampires can be destroyed in particular ways. Werewolves have their own vulnerabilities. Dracula has limitations despite his immense power. Those rules make the final confrontation possible. Without them, the climax would simply be two powerful characters fighting until one of them stopped moving. Instead, the movie spends much of its runtime quietly assembling the tools that will eventually matter. The crossbow matters. The silver matters. The monster matters. The werewolf curse matters. Dracula's inability to create life naturally matters. Anna's family oath matters. Van Helsing's mysterious connection to Dracula matters. And all of these threads are moving toward one enormous collision. But before the story reaches that point, the film has to make us understand the man at its center. Van Helsing is a strange hero because he is defined as much by what he does not remember as by what he knows. His past is a blank space. He does not have a conventional family history. He does not fully understand his own identity. And the film uses that absence as a source of tension. Perhaps this is why his relationship with Anna becomes important. She has too much history. He has too little. Anna is trapped by the past of her family. Van Helsing is haunted by the absence of his own. They therefore approach the same mystery from opposite directions. She knows where she comes from, but cannot escape it. He does not know where he comes from and may never be able to escape the consequences. That is more interesting than the romance alone. When Anna and Van Helsing begin working together, their trust develops through survival. They are repeatedly placed in situations where one person's life depends on the other. The movie does not have enough time to turn their relationship into an exceptionally deep romance, and that is one of its weaknesses. The emotional connection develops quickly because the plot itself moves quickly. But there is something convincing in the physical chemistry between Jackman and Beckinsale. Their characters understand danger in similar ways. Neither is comfortable surrendering control. Both are stubborn. Both are willing to put themselves in harm's way. And both are carrying ghosts. For Anna, the ghost is her family. For Van Helsing, it is his forgotten identity. For Frankenstein's monster, it is the rejection of humanity. For Dracula, it is the inability to create the future he wants. Four different forms of loneliness begin to emerge beneath the explosions and monster attacks. Dracula has enormous power, yet he cannot create genuine human connection. The monster has enormous physical strength, yet desperately wants acceptance. Anna is surrounded by the legacy of her family, yet increasingly isolated as that family disappears. Van Helsing has allies, yet remains emotionally separated from the people around him, because even he does not fully know who he is. This is one reason Van Helsing can be more interesting than its reputation sometimes suggests. Beneath the exaggerated action, there is a movie fascinated by people who cannot escape what they are. And Dracula is perhaps the clearest example. Richard Roxburgh does not play Dracula as a tragic romantic vampire. There is no attempt to make him the tortured lover of conventional Gothic adaptations. Instead, Roxburgh plays him like a flamboyant, aristocratic tyrant who knows that he is the most powerful creature in the room and enjoys reminding everyone of that fact. His performance is theatrical because the movie itself is theatrical. He smiles when he should be frightening. He jokes when the situation should be deadly serious. He moves with exaggerated confidence. He appears almost amused by the terror he creates. But beneath the theatricality is obsession. Dracula has everything except the one thing he wants. He has immortality. He has castles. He has servants. He has supernatural power. He has armies. Yet he cannot create life. That is the irony at the center of his character. The man who has defeated death is still terrified of what death prevents him from having. And that brings the story back to Frankenstein's monster. Dracula does not simply want to possess the creature. He wants to use him to defeat another limitation. The monster represents the possibility that death itself can be manipulated. But there is an important difference between Frankenstein's experiment and Dracula's ambition. Frankenstein wants to discover whether life can be created. Dracula wants to control the result. One is driven by curiosity, the other by domination, and the monster is caught between them. By the time Van Helsing fully understands what Dracula is planning, the mission has changed. This is no longer simply a request to kill a vampire. It is a race to prevent Dracula from turning an unnatural scientific miracle into the foundation of an unnatural dynasty. The danger is growing. The number of monsters is growing. The geography of the story is expanding from villages to castles, from laboratories to underground chambers, from forests to enormous supernatural strongholds. And the film keeps increasing the scale because that is what early 2000s blockbuster cinema was increasingly designed to do. Every threat must be bigger than the last. Every creature must be more spectacular. Every chase must move faster. Every castle must be larger. Every explosion must feel like it could be seen from the next country. Van Helsing does this with enthusiasm. Sometimes that enthusiasm is exactly what makes the movie entertaining. Sometimes it also creates the film's biggest problem. There are moments when the story moves so quickly that emotional consequences barely have time to settle. A character can experience something traumatic, and shortly afterward the film is already racing toward another creature attack. The movie is constantly introducing another piece of mythology, another monster, another location, or another action sequence. The result is exhilarating when it works. It can also feel crowded. But even that crowded quality tells us something about the movie's identity. Van Helsing was not designed as a quiet gothic horror film. It was designed as a giant cinematic ride through the mythology of classic monsters. And Stephen Sommers understood that kind of ride. His earlier success with The Mummy had already demonstrated his interest in combining adventure, humor, supernatural mythology, and spectacle. In Van Helsing, that formula becomes darker, stranger, and more overloaded. The movie is essentially asking, what if the classic Universal monsters had been placed inside an action-adventure universe? What if Dracula had an army? What if Frankenstein's monster could become the object of a global supernatural struggle? What if the Wolfman fought alongside the mythology instead of existing in a separate story? And what if the hero hunting all of them was given the physicality and equipment of a modern blockbuster action star? The answer is Van Helsing. Whether that answer is completely successful is another question. But the ambition is impossible to miss. And nowhere is that ambition more obvious than in the way the film treats Dracula's castle. It is not simply a home. It is a visual manifestation of Dracula's personality. Enormous, theatrical, dark, and seemingly designed to make everyone who enters it feel insignificant. The architecture becomes part of the threat. Stone corridors stretch into darkness. Bridges and towers create impossible vertical spaces. Lightning reveals silhouettes. Fire illuminates faces only partially. The film constantly uses contrast. Darkness against sudden light, cold stone against fire, black clothing against pale skin, to make the world feel like a living Gothic painting. This heightened visual style is one of the film's strongest qualities because it gives Van Helsing a distinctive identity even when the plot becomes overloaded. The movie does not look ordinary. It looks like a nightmare that has been given a blockbuster budget. And that visual identity extends to Dracula himself. Roxburgh's costume and makeup are deliberately extravagant. His appearance changes depending on his state, and the film is willing to push him beyond human proportions when the story demands it. His physical presence becomes increasingly monstrous as the film reveals what he truly is. The same is true of the werewolves. Their design is not intended to resemble a realistic animal. It is designed to look like a nightmare version of a human being transformed into a predator. And this is where the visual effects become particularly important. In 2004, digital effects had already reached the point where filmmakers could create creatures capable of running, fighting, and transforming on screen in ways that would have been extraordinarily difficult only a decade earlier. But the technology was still developing. Modern audiences accustomed to contemporary visual effects may notice places where the digital creatures look more artificial than today's creations. That does not make the work meaningless. It is more useful to understand the film in its technological moment. The werewolf transformations are trying to solve one of the oldest problems in monster cinema. How do you show a human being becoming an animal while keeping the transformation frightening, physical, and readable? The answer here involves digital manipulation, creature work, and performance. The body stretches, changes shape, and becomes something predatory. The transformation is not merely a makeup effect. It is a demonstration of the technological possibilities of its era. And because the werewolf is connected directly to Velkan, the effect is not only visual. Every time the creature appears, there is a human tragedy underneath it. That is what gives the werewolf storyline more weight than a simple monster chase. Velkan was Anna's brother. Now he is one of the creatures she has spent her life fighting. And eventually, the film will make that tragedy part of its final solution. But the audience is not there yet. At this stage, Van Helsing and Anna are still trying to understand the rules of the world they have entered. Carl is still discovering clues. The monster is still being hunted. Dracula is still preparing his plan. And somewhere beneath the mystery of Dracula's immortality lies another mystery that is even more personal. Why does Dracula seem to recognize Van Helsing? Why does the vampire look at him as though he is seeing an old enemy rather than a stranger? The answer will eventually transform the meaning of Van Helsing's mission. Because the most dangerous monster in the story may not be the one Van Helsing has been sent to kill. It may be the part of himself that he has forgotten. And as the night closes over Transylvania, the hunter and the vampire move closer to the confrontation that neither of them fully understands yet. One is trying to destroy the past. The other may be the reason that past was erased. And somewhere between them stands Frankenstein's monster, the creature who never asked to be born, the key to Dracula's impossible ambition, and perhaps the most human soul in a story filled with monsters. The real question is no longer whether Van Helsing can kill Dracula. It is whether anyone in this world can truly escape the thing they were created to become. The deeper Van Helsing travels into Transylvania, the less the mission resembles the simple assignment he was originally given. Kill Dracula. Protect the Valerious family. Find Frankenstein's monster. Return to Rome. On paper, it sounds almost manageable. But this is Van Helsing, and nothing stays simple for long. The first real complication is Anna's brother. Velkan is not dead. At least, not in the way Anna believed. He has become a werewolf. That revelation changes the emotional temperature of the story, because suddenly, the supernatural threat is no longer an abstract evil waiting somewhere inside a castle. It has entered Anna's family. The curse has taken someone she loves and turned him into something she is expected to kill. There is a cruel irony in that transformation. Anna has spent years believing that the Valerious family exists to destroy monsters, yet the person she most wants to save has become one of those monsters. Her family's mission and her personal love have collided. The film does not linger on this contradiction as long as a slower horror movie might, but it gives Velkan enough presence for the tragedy to register. He is not simply a disposable character introduced so the plot can have a werewolf. He is the emotional bridge between Anna's family story and the supernatural mythology surrounding Dracula. And the werewolf itself is one of the movie's most memorable creations. The creature is enormous, muscular and feral, but the important detail is that there is still something recognizable about the man underneath it. The eyes, the movement, the moments of hesitation, all of these remind us that this is not a completely separate creature. It is Velkan trapped inside a curse. That makes every encounter with him uncomfortable. Van Helsing knows what he has to do. Anna knows what she wants him to do. And neither of them can pretend that the situation is anything other than tragic. The film also uses the werewolf curse as a way of introducing another important rule into its supernatural universe. A werewolf is not simply killed by ordinary weapons. Silver is required. That detail seems almost like traditional monster movie trivia at first, but Van Helsing quietly turns it into a piece of future storytelling machinery. The movie is constantly planting these rules. Silver, vampires, holy objects, transformation. The monster. Dracula's inability to create life. The audience may not immediately understand why each detail matters, but the final act depends upon the accumulated knowledge. That is one of the ways Van Helsing follows the logic of old monster movies while presenting them through modern action filmmaking. The monsters have rules, and once the characters learn those rules become weapons. Van Helsing's greatest advantage is therefore not simply strength. It is knowledge. And Carl becomes essential because he helps turn that knowledge into practical tools. David Wenham gives Carl a completely different energy from Hugh Jackman's Van Helsing. Jackman is controlled and physically imposing. Wenham is nervous, expressive, and often visibly overwhelmed by the creatures around him. Yet Carl never feels useless. That distinction is important. The easy version of this character would have been the frightened sidekick, who exists only to make jokes whenever the hero enters danger. But Carl actually understands the supernatural world. He reads clues. He knows religious traditions. He knows what weapons are likely to work. He is capable of constructing and using equipment that gives Van Helsing an advantage against creatures who would otherwise be almost impossible to defeat. He is also the character most willing to acknowledge how ridiculous their circumstances have become. That is part of why the humor works when it works. The movie knows that its premise is outrageous. It does not ask the audience to treat every moment with solemn gothic seriousness. Dracula can be terrifying in one scene and almost flamboyant in the next. Carl can react with disbelief, while Van Helsing calmly loads a weapon. The vampire brides can appear like figures from a Gothic painting before launching themselves into an action sequence. The tone is constantly balancing horror and adventure. That balance was very much part of Stephen Sommers' filmmaking identity. After The Mummy, Sommers had already demonstrated that he was comfortable combining monsters with humor and spectacle. He was not interested in recreating the atmosphere of a slow, atmospheric universal horror film exactly as it had existed decades earlier. He wanted movement. He wanted chases. He wanted creatures to collide. He wanted the audience to feel that the movie was always one step away from becoming even larger. And Van Helsing is built around that escalation. A vampire attack becomes a larger vampire threat. The vampire threat leads to Dracula. Dracula leads to Frankenstein's monster. The monster leads to Dracula's plan. Velkin introduces the werewolves. And eventually all of those elements will converge. But before they do, Van Helsing and Anna have to survive the world Dracula has created. Their first major encounters reveal something important about Anna herself. She is not fearless. That would actually make her less interesting. Anna understands fear because she has lived with it. She has watched members of her family disappear. She has spent years surrounded by supernatural threats. Her courage comes from acting despite fear, rather than from being immune to it. Kate Beckinsale's performance benefits from that distinction. Anna has a physical confidence that fits the action-adventure structure, but Beckinsale also gives her moments of uncertainty. There is grief beneath the aggression.
No time to lose.
She is quick to challenge Van Helsing because trusting someone from outside her family is difficult. Her anger is not simply a personality trait. It is protective. She has learned that hesitation can get people killed. Van Helsing, meanwhile, has a completely different relationship with danger. He is almost professionally detached from it. That difference produces much of their chemistry. Anna sees danger as something personal. Van Helsing sees it as something to solve. When a vampire attacks, Anna reacts as a woman who has spent her life fighting a war.
By ancient
Van
oaths.
Helsing reacts as a hunter evaluating the target. Their partnership begins to work because those perspectives complement each other. She knows the territory. He knows the enemy. She knows what Dracula has done to her family. He knows how monsters behave. Neither has the complete picture. That is why they need each other. And the more time they spend together, the more the film begins to hint that Van Helsing's mission may have consequences far beyond Dracula's immediate plans. Dracula's reaction to him is particularly revealing. There is something personal in it. He does not behave as though Van Helsing is merely another hunter. He seems to know him, or at least to recognize something about him. The movie withholds the answer long enough for the question to become part of Van Helsing's identity. Who was he before the Vatican found him? What happened to his memory? Why is he so effective against supernatural creatures? Why does Dracula react to him with such intense hostility? And perhaps most importantly, why does Van Helsing himself seem to possess a strange instinct for violence against monsters? The film does not immediately answer those questions because the mystery works better when it remains incomplete. At this point, Van Helsing is defined by an absence. Everyone else has a history. Anna has the Valerious legacy. Dracula has centuries of history. Frankenstein's monster has the memory of his creation. Velkin has a family. Karl has the institutional knowledge of the Vatican. Van Helsing has almost nothing. That makes him an unusually appropriate hero for this story. He is surrounded by characters obsessed with the past, while he is the one character who cannot remember his own. And Dracula's presence gradually makes that absence feel less like an ordinary mystery and more like a warning. Meanwhile, the search for Frankenstein's monster continues. The creature has become the most valuable target in Transylvania. Dracula wants him. Van Helsing needs to find him. Anna wants to keep him away from Dracula, and the monster is trying to escape everyone. That last part is important because it prevents the story from turning him into a simple object. He has agency. He understands that Dracula intends to use him. He knows that humans are afraid of him, and he knows that being captured by either side could mean death. The monster's loneliness, therefore, becomes one of the quieter threads running beneath the film. He was created by a man who died almost immediately afterward. He was rejected by society before he had a chance to understand it. He is hunted because of his appearance. And now the one person who wants him is perhaps the most dangerous creature alive. It is difficult not to feel sympathy for him. That sympathy is largely created by Shula Hensley's performance. The monster could have become an effects showcase, especially in a film this committed to visual spectacle. Instead, Hensley gives him a recognizable emotional life. His physical movements often look cautious rather than aggressive. He watches people. He reacts to their expressions. He seems almost apologetic for his own existence. That is a significant choice because it changes the audience's relationship with the creature. The film wants us to fear him visually, but trust him emotionally. And that contradiction connects him to the larger Frankenstein tradition. The original literary tradition surrounding Frankenstein is deeply concerned with responsibility. What happens when someone creates life but refuses to take responsibility for the being they have created? Van Helsing simplifies that question into a more accessible monster adventure story, but the emotional residue remains. The monster exists because someone wanted to conquer the boundary between life and death. Now Dracula wants to exploit that achievement for his own purposes. The cycle is becoming clear. Someone breaks a natural boundary. Someone else sees an opportunity. The creature suffers the consequences. That cycle is repeated throughout the movie. Dracula himself is obsessed with breaking the boundaries imposed by nature. Frankenstein broke one boundary by creating life. Van Helsing will eventually break another by becoming a werewolf. Anna struggles against the inherited boundaries of her family oath. Everyone is trying, in some way, to escape a condition they did not choose. But not everyone is trying to escape it for the same reason. Dracula wants control. The monster wants acceptance. Anna wants freedom from the curse hanging over her family. Van Helsing wants answers. And this is why Dracula is more interesting than a generic villain, even though the film does not always explore him with the depth that the idea deserves. Richard Roxburgh plays him with a kind of extravagant impatience. He is powerful enough that ordinary threats mean very little to him. He does not need to scream to dominate a room. He often appears amused. His arrogance becomes part of his danger. He does not merely believe he is superior. He behaves as though superiority is an obvious fact. His relationship with his vampire brides reinforces that image. They are not presented as equal partners. They are extensions of his power and part of the enormous supernatural machinery surrounding him. The brides also give the movie some of its strongest visual imagery. They glide through darkness. Their movements can shift from graceful to predatory almost instantly. Their appearances are exaggerated, with elaborate costumes and pale supernatural features that make them look less like ordinary humans and more like living Gothic illustrations. This is where the movie's visual effects and costume design work together. The creatures are not simply designed to look scary. They are designed to look iconic. That distinction matters in a movie like Van Helsing because nearly every major creature needs to be recognizable in seconds. The audience has to know when Dracula appears. They have to know when a bride attacks. They have to know when a werewolf enters the frame. They have to know when the monster is present. The film's production design, therefore, operates almost like visual shorthand. Stone means ancient power. Lightning means supernatural revelation. Fire means destruction. Blackness means danger. Silver means vulnerability. And red becomes associated with blood, violence, and Dracula's world. The lighting is rarely naturalistic. The movie wants dramatic shadows. It wants faces emerging from darkness. It wants castles illuminated by lightning. It wants fog rolling across landscapes. The world feels like a stage designed for monsters. And that is exactly the point. Van Helsing is not attempting realism. It is creating a heightened Gothic fantasy. The same approach appears in the costumes. Van Helsing's clothing immediately separates him from the ordinary inhabitants of the world. His outfit is practical enough to suggest a hunter, but stylized enough to make him look like an action icon. Anna's costumes combine period inspiration with the needs of an action heroine. She must be able to move, fight and ride, but she also has to look as though she belongs to this Gothic aristocratic world. Dracula's clothing, by contrast, is deliberately theatrical. He is not trying to blend in. He wants to look like Dracula. The vampire brides follow the same philosophy. Carl is more understated, which helps distinguish him from the supernatural characters around him. The costumes, therefore, establish character before dialogue does. You can often tell what kind of person has entered the frame simply by looking at the silhouette. That is one of the reasons the movie remains visually memorable, even when individual scenes may feel dated by modern standards. Its imagination is easy to recognize. And then there is the Vatican. The Vatican's role in the movie is one of its most unusual inventions. The film takes an institution associated with religious tradition and gives it the feel of a secret supernatural intelligence organization. That concept allows Van Helsing to combine medieval imagery with fantasy technology. Ancient symbols sit alongside specialized weapons. Religious artifacts become tools. Knowledge accumulated over centuries becomes practical monster-hunting intelligence. This is not historical Vatican history. It is fantasy mythology. And within the world of the movie, the Vatican functions as the bridge between faith and action. Van Helsing does not simply fight monsters because he enjoys fighting. He has been given a mission. There is an institution behind him. There are rules. There is a larger purpose. That makes his role different from a lone hunter wandering through the countryside. He is part of an organized war against supernatural forces. Carl reinforces that idea because he understands the institutional side of their mission. He knows what the Vatican knows. He knows the legends. He understands the equipment. And his presence also gives the movie an opportunity to joke about the absurdity of their technology. The film's weapons are deliberately extravagant. Van Helsing's crossbow is perhaps the clearest example. It is not a historically ordinary hunting weapon. It is an action movie crossbow. It looks powerful. It fires with dramatic force, and it becomes part of the hero's visual signature. The same principle applies to the firearms and specialized ammunition. The movie wants Van Helsing to feel like someone who has brought a modern action arsenal into a gothic nightmare. That is one of the reasons the character feels less like Stoker's professor and more like a precursor to the supernatural action heroes that became increasingly common in fantasy cinema. The film's relationship with its literary source material is therefore deliberately loose. The name Van Helsing comes from Bram Stoker. The classic vampire mythology comes from centuries of folklore and literature. Frankenstein's monster comes from Mary Shelley. The werewolf tradition has its own long history, but the movie does not attempt to faithfully adapt any one of those stories. It creates a new mythology out of familiar pieces. That was an unusual approach at the time, although audiences today may find the concept more familiar because interconnected fictional universes have become so common. The important difference is that Van Helsing was not part of a massive, carefully planned cinematic universe in the modern corporate sense. It was essentially a single giant crossover adventure. The characters are being brought together because the filmmakers want to see what happens when classic monster mythology collides. That gives the film a kind of freedom. It does not have to obey every detail of Dracula's literary history. It can change Frankenstein. It can change Van Helsing. It can redesign the werewolf. It can make Dracula the villain of an enormous supernatural action story. The audience is being asked to recognize the monsters without expecting exact fidelity. And in that respect, the movie understands something important about adaptation. Sometimes familiarity comes not from accuracy, but from recognition. You know Dracula when you see him. You know Frankenstein's monster when you see him. You know a werewolf when it rises from the darkness. The movie can therefore alter the details while preserving the cultural image. As Van Helsing and Anna continue their pursuit, their relationship becomes more trusting. Not because either character suddenly becomes sentimental, but because the danger forces cooperation. They begin to understand how the other person operates. Anna learns that Van Helsing will take risks to protect her.
We are
Van
bound
Helsing
by
learns
ancient
that
oaths.
Anna is not someone who needs to be protected from every danger. She can
We are
handle
bound
herself.
by ancient
That is
oaths.
important for the eventual romance. Their attraction is built through action rather than long conversations. They fight together. They escape together. They argue. They protect one another. And slowly, the professional partnership becomes personal. But the movie never allows them much peace. There is always another threat. Another creature. Another clue. Another reason to keep moving. This relentless pace is both the movie's strength and its weakness. If you are watching Van Helsing for momentum, it delivers. There is almost always something happening. The film rarely sits still long enough for boredom to take hold. But if you want certain emotional developments to breathe, the speed can become frustrating. Anna's grief over Velkin could have been explored more deeply. Van Helsing's identity could have received more psychological attention. Dracula's obsession with creating life could have been given greater philosophical weight. The monster's loneliness could have become an entire emotional storyline. Instead, the movie keeps returning to spectacle. That choice is understandable. This is a 2-hour-plus blockbuster built around monsters. But it also explains why some viewers find Van Helsing entertaining without finding it particularly profound. The film contains deeper ideas than it has time to fully explore. And yet those ideas are still there. The best example is the monster. Every time he appears, the film becomes slightly more human. The action may continue around him, but his presence changes the emotional stakes. If Dracula gets him, the monster dies. If the Vatican gets him, he may be imprisoned or studied. If the villagers find him, they may kill him. He has nowhere to belong. That makes his eventual escape much more meaningful than simply saving a creature from the villain. The monster is trying to find somewhere he can exist without being hunted. And that makes him a strange mirror of Van Helsing.
We are
Both
bound
are
by
outsiders.
ancient oaths.
Both are physically capable of violence. Both are feared
We are
because of
bound
what people
by
believe
ancient
about
oaths.
them. But their relationships with violence are completely different. The monster fights because he wants to survive. Van Helsing fights because he has been trained to protect others. Dracula fights because he wants control. 3 characters, 3 relationships with power, and 3 different ideas of what it means to be a monster. That question becomes increasingly important as the story approaches its middle. Because Van Helsing himself is about to become something he has spent his life hunting. The irony is already visible. The professional monster hunter believes monsters can be controlled through knowledge, weapons, and discipline. But what happens when the curse enters his own body? What happens when the hunter becomes the hunted? The film is quietly preparing the answer, and the werewolf curse will eventually provide it. But before Van Helsing reaches that point, Dracula's plan has to become fully visible. The monster is the key. Dracula wants to use him to create offspring. And those offspring are not merely a few additional vampires. They are intended to be an army. That is why Dracula's castle is more than a lair. It is a factory of supernatural reproduction. The imagery is deliberately grotesque. Rows of vampire offspring, dark chambers, organic shapes mixed with machinery. The boundaries between biology, magic, and technology become increasingly unclear. This is one of the film's strongest thematic connections. Frankenstein's science and Dracula's supernatural power are not really opposites anymore.
We are bound by ancient oaths.
The vampire wants to use science to solve a biological problem.
We are bound
The scientist's
by ancient
creation
oaths.
has become a tool for supernatural reproduction. The monster is therefore standing at the center of a collision between 2 forms of forbidden knowledge. And the more Van Helsing learns, the more he realizes that killing Dracula may not be enough. The entire system has to be stopped. That is why Anna cannot simply retreat to safety. That is why Karl cannot simply return to the Vatican. That is why the monster cannot simply disappear into the forest. And that is why Van Helsing cannot treat this as another mission. The story has become personal for everyone. Anna is fighting for her family. Van Helsing is fighting for people who have become his companions. Karl is fighting beside the man he serves. The monster is fighting for his life. And Dracula is fighting for the future he believes he deserves. There is something almost tragic about Dracula's motivation if you strip away the theatrical villainy. He has lived for centuries. He has defeated death. Yet he cannot accept the limitations that remain. Immortality has not satisfied him. It has made him more ambitious. He wants a future that belongs to him. He wants descendants.
I won't be broken!
He wants an empire that will continue beyond even his own endless existence. In other words, he wants legacy. That makes him strangely similar to the Valerious family. Anna's family is also obsessed with legacy, but the difference is moral. The Valerious family inherited a responsibility to destroy Dracula. Dracula wants to create a legacy based on himself. One is inheritance as duty. The other is inheritance as domination. Anna has been born into a mission she did not choose. Dracula has chosen the mission himself. The monster has been born into a world he never asked for. Van Helsing has lost the memory of the world he came from. The film keeps returning to characters who have been defined by circumstances beyond their control. And eventually, the question becomes whether they can choose something different. Anna can choose to trust Van Helsing. The monster can choose to survive rather than become Dracula's weapon. Van Helsing can choose to protect people rather than simply complete a mission. Even Dracula has choices, and he consistently chooses power. That is what ultimately makes him the villain. Not the fact that he is a vampire, not the fact that he is immortal, not even the fact that he is supernatural. It is what he chooses to do with those abilities. As the pursuit intensifies, the movie begins to accelerate toward one of its most important discoveries. Van Helsing's connection to Dracula is not accidental. Their conflict feels older than their meeting. The vampire's hatred seems to come from recognition, and the mystery surrounding Van Helsing's identity begins to feel increasingly connected to the supernatural world itself. The audience knows something is being withheld. Van Helsing does not. That creates a peculiar dramatic irony. We are watching a hero investigate a world that may know more about him than he knows about himself. And this is where Hugh Jackman's performance becomes particularly useful. He plays the mystery without turning Van Helsing into a constantly confused character. The man is still competent, still determined, still sarcastic at times, but there is a slight emotional distance in him. He rarely appears completely comfortable. Even when he succeeds, there is a sense that he is searching for something he cannot name. That gives the character more depth than simply making him a monster-killing action hero. He is trying to understand himself through the monsters he fights. And Dracula may hold the answer. But answers in Van Helsing rarely come without a price. The closer Van Helsing gets to Dracula, the closer he moves toward discovering the truth about his own past. The closer Anna gets to Dracula, the closer she moves toward the fate her family has been trying to prevent for generations. The closer the monster gets to freedom, the more valuable he becomes to the villain. And the closer the story gets to its final confrontation, the more every monster begins to connect to another. This is the movie's great structural trick. What initially feels like too many ideas eventually begins to form a single chain. Frankenstein creates the monster. Dracula needs the monster. Dracula's plan threatens Anna. Anna's family has sworn to destroy Dracula. Vulcan's curse introduces the werewolf. The werewolf's curse will eventually become relevant to Dracula's defeat. Van Helsing is sent to Transylvania. Van Helsing's own identity becomes connected to Dracula. Carl provides the knowledge needed to understand the supernatural rules. The pieces are not random. They are moving toward the same collision. And once the movie reaches that collision, there will be no easy way back. But before that final convergence, the film gives us another glimpse of what Dracula's ambition has created. The offspring. They are not merely frightening because there are many of them. They are frightening because they represent the future Dracula wants. An army born from the corruption of life itself. The monster looks at them and becomes a reminder of the difference between being alive and being created for a purpose. He was created accidentally, then rejected. Dracula wants to create deliberately, then control. The monster wants freedom. Dracula wants obedience. That contrast is central. And for all its noise and spectacle, Van Helsing understands that a monster is not defined simply by appearance. Sometimes the most frightening character is the one who sees other living beings as tools. That is Dracula. The monster may look like an abomination, but he is capable of empathy. Dracula may look elegant, intelligent, and aristocratic, but he treats existence as something he owns. The film therefore keeps turning its visual assumptions upside down. The creature looks monstrous, but behaves humanely. The human-looking vampire behaves monstrously. The hunter eventually becomes a monster. The woman who belongs to an ancient noble family fights like a soldier. The priestly institution possesses weapons that resemble futuristic machinery. Everything is familiar, and everything has been rearranged. That is ultimately what Van Helsing is doing with the classic monster tradition. It is taking familiar shapes and putting them into unfamiliar relationships. Dracula is no longer the isolated vampire. Frankenstein's monster is no longer merely Frankenstein's tragedy. The werewolf is no longer simply a cursed man wandering through a separate story. Van Helsing is no longer merely a professor. They are pieces of one mythology. And once those pieces begin moving toward one another, the movie becomes much more than a sequence of monster encounters. It becomes a war over life, a war over death, a war over identity, a war over whether the past will determine the future. And standing in the middle of it is a man who cannot remember his own past. Van Helsing has come to Transylvania to kill Dracula. He does not yet understand that Dracula may be the one creature capable of telling him who he really is. And if that is true, then destroying Dracula may mean destroying the last link to the identity Van Helsing has spent his entire life trying to recover. The hunter is beginning to realize that the monster he has been pursuing may also be holding the answer to the mystery inside him. That makes the coming confrontation more dangerous than a simple battle between good and evil. Because before Van Helsing can defeat Dracula, he may have to discover exactly what kind of man he is. And in this world, discovering what you are can be almost as frightening as becoming a monster. By this point, the mission has stopped being a mission. Van Helsing may have arrived in Transylvania with orders from the Vatican, but the deeper he goes into Dracula's world, the more those orders become secondary to the people standing beside him. Anna is no longer simply the woman whose family needs protection. Carl is no longer simply the man carrying the equipment. Frankenstein's monster is no longer simply the creature Dracula wants to capture. They have become connected by the same danger, and Dracula has begun to understand that connection. That is precisely what makes him dangerous. Dracula does not need to defeat Van Helsing in a straightforward fight. He can attack the things around him. And the first person to feel the consequences is Anna. The Valerious family's conflict with Dracula is centuries old, but for Anna it has never been mythology. It has been her life. The family's oath has given her purpose, but it has also trapped her inside a story written long before she was born. Every generation has inherited the same enemy, the same promise, and the same impossible expectation. There is something almost cruel about the idea. Imagine being born into a family where your destiny has already been decided. You are not simply Anna. You are a Valerious. You are expected to finish what your ancestors started. You are expected to destroy Dracula. You are expected to restore the family's honor. And if you fail, the dead remain trapped by the consequences. The film does not turn Anna into a philosopher discussing inherited responsibility, but the idea is embedded in almost everything she does. Her determination is partly courage and partly obligation. She fights because she wants to survive, but she also fights because she believes she has to. Van Helsing approaches the same problem differently. He has no family legacy to guide him. He has an institutional mission. The Vatican tells him where to go and what to do, but it does not tell him who he is. That distinction becomes increasingly important as Dracula's connection to him becomes impossible to ignore. The vampire's hatred has a strange intimacy to it. When Dracula sees Van Helsing, he does not react as though another hunter has arrived. He reacts as though an old enemy has returned, and that raises the central mystery surrounding the hero. Van Helsing does not know his own past, but perhaps Dracula does. This is where the movie's supernatural mythology starts folding back into its character story. The mystery is no longer an isolated question inserted to make the hero seem interesting. It becomes connected to the villain, the Vatican, and the entire reason Van Helsing exists in this world. There is an almost deliberate irony in the way the film handles memory. Anna remembers too much. Van Helsing remembers too little. Dracula remembers centuries. The monster has only the memories of his creation. Each character is therefore defined by a different relationship with the past. And the past is not neutral. For Anna, it is an obligation. For Dracula, it is power. For the monster, it is trauma. For Van Helsing, it is a missing piece. The movie's fascination with memory is easy to overlook because it is surrounded by action. But it is one of the reasons the ending eventually carries more emotional weight than the explosive middle sections might suggest. Van Helsing is not only hunting Dracula, he is hunting the truth about himself. And Dracula knows it. That makes their conflict personal long before either man understands exactly why. But Dracula has more immediate problems to solve. His plan involving Frankenstein's monster is moving forward. The monster's body contains the secret Dracula needs. The vampire has discovered a way to use the creature's unique existence to power the creation of his offspring. The process is grotesque precisely because it turns a miracle into a manufacturing system. Frankenstein wanted to create one living being. Dracula wants to create an army. That difference says almost everything about the two characters. Frankenstein's ambition is dangerous because it ignores the consequences of creation. Dracula's ambition is dangerous because it completely embraces those consequences. He does not care about the individual. He cares about numbers. He wants an army large enough to overwhelm humanity. The monster, who was created as an individual experiment, is therefore being reduced to a component. That is why his escape matters. It is not simply a rescue mission. It is a struggle over whether a living being can remain a person when everyone around him sees him as a tool. This is one of the strongest emotional ideas in Van Helsing, and Schuyler Hensley carries much of it without needing long speeches. The monster's face is heavily altered by makeup and prosthetic work, yet his reactions remain readable. Fear, confusion, suspicion, relief, desperation. There are moments when he looks at Van Helsing almost as though he is trying to decide whether this man is another captor, or perhaps the first person who might actually help him. And Van Helsing's response is significant. He does not treat the monster like an animal. He understands that there is a person inside the body. That choice distinguishes him from Dracula. It also helps define the moral center of the story. The hero is not the man who kills the most monsters. He is the man who understands that some of the monsters need saving. That idea becomes even more important when the story returns to Velkan. The werewolf curse has turned Anna's brother into a creature that she cannot emotionally separate from the man he used to be. The physical transformation is spectacular, but the tragedy is simple. Velkan is still her brother. The werewolf is not an unrelated monster. It is him. The film uses the werewolf as a different kind of supernatural horror from Dracula. Dracula is deliberate. The werewolf is involuntary. Dracula chooses. Velkan suffers. That makes the curse more tragic, and it gives the eventual werewolf mythology an important function in the final act. The audience learns that silver is deadly to werewolves, but there is another detail that becomes crucial. The curse can also be used as a weapon against Dracula. That is one of the movie's most effective pieces of narrative preparation. A curse that initially appears to be another problem eventually becomes the key to solving the larger problem. The film keeps doing this. A monster becomes a weapon. A weakness becomes an advantage. A tragedy becomes part of the solution. A mystery becomes a revelation. The story's different elements are beginning to converge, and as the pressure rises, Anna and Van Helsing's relationship changes. They have already fought together. They have already saved one another. Now they begin to trust each other emotionally. The romance is still moving quickly, but it works best when it grows out of their shared isolation. Anna is a woman who has spent years believing that her family's mission comes before everything else. Van Helsing is a man whose identity has been stripped away from him. Both are lonely in different ways. Both understand what it means to be responsible for something larger than themselves. And both know that the other person is risking their life for a cause that could easily consume them. Kate Beckinsale gives Anna an intensity that helps prevent the romance from becoming completely weightless. She does not play Anna as someone swept away by the arrival of a handsome stranger. Anna is attracted to Van Helsing, but she also evaluates him. Can she trust him? Will he stay? Does he really care about her family? Will he risk himself for the monster? And most importantly, will he stand beside her when the danger becomes personal? Van Helsing gradually answers those questions through action. That is the language he understands best. He may not be able to explain his past, but he can put himself between Anna and a monster. He can risk his life. He can fight. And for Anna, that matters. The relationship is therefore less about conventional romance than about recognition. She sees the man underneath the mysterious hunter. He sees the woman underneath the Valerious obligation. That makes their connection more believable than the amount of screen time might suggest. But Van Helsing never lets the relationship become the only story. There are too many monsters waiting, and the biggest one is Dracula. Richard Roxburgh's performance becomes increasingly extravagant as the story progresses. His Dracula is not subtle, but subtlety would almost be out of place here. The entire film is operating at a heightened level, and Roxburgh matches that energy. His Dracula can be charming and terrifying within seconds. He can deliver a threat with theatrical confidence. He can behave like an aristocrat one moment and something completely inhuman the next. There is even a kind of humor in his arrogance. He knows he is powerful. He knows everyone fears him. And he is offended when someone refuses to behave accordingly. That theatricality makes him memorable, but it also creates one of the movie's biggest tonal challenges. At times, Dracula is frightening. At other times, he is almost cartoonishly flamboyant. Whether that works depends largely on what the audience expects from the movie. If you expect gothic horror, the performance may seem excessive. If you accept the film as a gothic action fantasy, the exaggeration becomes part of the fun. That distinction is essential when judging Van Helsing. The film should not be criticized for failing to be a movie it never intended to make. It was never trying to become the definitive psychological adaptation of Dracula. It wanted Dracula to be larger than life, and Roxburgh understood that. His performance is physical as well as vocal. His posture changes when he is angry. His gestures are deliberate. His facial expressions are often exaggerated. The costume and makeup reinforce the sense that he is not merely a man who happens to be a vampire. He is Dracula as an icon. That is why the movie can transform him into an enormous supernatural creature without feeling like it has suddenly changed genres. The human form was always a costume. The monster underneath was always there. The same philosophy applies to the vampire brides. Their beauty is part of the danger. Their movement is part of the horror. Their presence reminds the audience that Dracula's world is built around seduction and death existing together. They are not ordinary servants. They are extensions of his kingdom. And their eventual destruction becomes another sign that Dracula's world is beginning to collapse. But the biggest threat to Dracula is still not Anna. It is Van Helsing. And Dracula knows it. This is where the film begins revealing something that has been hidden beneath the entire story. Van Helsing is not simply an exceptionally talented hunter. There is something supernatural about him. His past is connected to Dracula. The film eventually reveals that Van Helsing was once an angelic figure, Gabriel, who fought Dracula centuries earlier. This revelation is one of the movie's boldest pieces of mythology because it changes the hero's identity from mysterious human agent into something almost mythological. Van Helsing is not simply a man who has forgotten his childhood. He is someone whose history has been deliberately separated from him. And Dracula remembers. Suddenly, the villain's hatred makes sense. The conflict is not new. It is a continuation. The two have fought before. Van Helsing may have forgotten. Dracula has not. This also explains why Van Helsing seems instinctively comfortable fighting supernatural creatures. His abilities are not entirely learned. They are part of a much older identity. The revelation is not handled with the psychological complexity it might have received in a darker film, but it performs an important narrative function. It explains the hero. It explains the villain's fear. And it gives the final confrontation a mythic quality. Dracula is not merely fighting the man sent by the Vatican. He is facing an old enemy who has returned. And the strange part is that Van Helsing does not even know the full history of the battle. He is fighting a war he has forgotten. That is a powerful concept. It also makes the Vatican's relationship with him more interesting. Why was he chosen? Why was he trusted with missions involving supernatural threats? Why was his past hidden? The movie leaves some of those questions intentionally mysterious, rather than building a detailed mythology around them. That can be frustrating, but it also contributes to the character's mystique. Van Helsing is defined by unanswered questions. He is more legend than biography. That is appropriate for a character designed as a modern monster hunter. And it is also why Hugh Jackman works so well in the role. He does not need to explain every aspect of Van Helsing. His physical presence does much of the work. He looks like someone capable of surviving the world the movie has created. He has the confidence of an action hero, but not the complete certainty of a traditional superhero. There is still vulnerability. There is still confusion. There is still the sense that something is missing.
We have no time to
and that
lose.
missing piece is his memory. Memory, once again, becomes the film's invisible thread. Anna is trying to preserve her family's memory. Dracula has centuries of memory. The monster is trying to understand his first memories. Van Helsing is trying to recover his. The movie may not announce this theme, but it keeps returning to it. And memory becomes especially important because the story is ultimately about mortality. Dracula has defeated death, but remains obsessed with what death prevents. The monster has been brought back from death, and now fears being destroyed. Anna's family has spent generations trying to defeat Dracula so that their dead ancestors can finally find peace. Van Helsing can fight almost anything, but he cannot prevent the loss of someone he loves. That last point will eventually define the ending. But before we reach it, the movie needs to bring its various monsters together. The castle becomes the center of the conflict, and visually, it is where the film's production design reaches its most extravagant level. The filmmakers create a world of enormous stone structures, bridges, towers, and laboratories. Everything is designed to feel larger than human scale. The architecture does not simply provide locations for action. It creates a sense that Dracula's world existed before the characters arrived and will continue after they leave. That is important because Gothic architecture traditionally works through scale. People look small against castles. Characters become silhouettes against enormous walls. Doors become thresholds between safety and danger. Stairs become paths toward unknown spaces. In Van Helsing, those principles are amplified by blockbuster filmmaking. The camera moves. The characters run. Creatures leap. The environment becomes part of the action. The result is less like a traditional haunted house movie, and more like a theme park ride designed by someone obsessed with Gothic horror. And that description is not necessarily an insult. There is something deliberately pleasurable about the movie's artificiality. It wants you to enjoy the spectacle. It wants you to see the castle and think, of course Dracula lives there. It wants the laboratory to be absurdly large. It wants lightning at precisely the right moment. It wants the monsters to emerge dramatically. The movie's sincerity is therefore not in realism. It is in commitment. It commits completely to its fantasy. That is why some of the movie's excesses remain charming. You may not believe in the architecture. You may not believe in the technology. You may not believe that a Vatican agent would carry those weapons. But for 2 hours, the film wants you to believe in the world. And sometimes it succeeds. One of the biggest contributors to that atmosphere is Alan Silvestri's score. The music understands the movie's scale. It does not behave like a minimalist horror score. It is orchestral, dramatic, and constantly pushing the adventure forward. When danger approaches, the music gives the scene weight. When the characters enter a castle, The score makes the location feel mythic. When the action begins, the music increases the sense of movement. When the film finally slows down for emotional moments, the score gives those scenes a sense of melancholy. The music is essential because the movie changes tone so often. Without a strong musical identity, the shifts between horror, comedy, action and romance could feel even more disconnected. Instead, the score helps make them feel like different movements of the same fantasy. The sound design works similarly. Werewolves do not simply appear. They have physical weight. Their movement has impact. Their growls and roars create a sense of animal aggression. Vampires move differently. Their attacks have a supernatural quality. Weapons have exaggerated force. Explosions are loud. The environment itself is constantly making noise. Wind, thunder, machinery, fire, footsteps, collapsing structures. The world feels active. And that matters because the film's visual effects are often strongest when they are supported by sound. A creature becomes more convincing when its movement has weight. An explosion becomes more dramatic when the sound arrives with physical force. A transformation becomes more disturbing when the character's screams and breathing remain connected to the changing body. The werewolf transformations are particularly important here. The transformation is one of the most recognizable pieces of werewolf mythology, and Van Helsing treats it as a spectacle. Bones shift, the body stretches, the face changes, the human shape disappears beneath the animal. The digital work may look more artificial to contemporary viewers, but the ambition remains impressive. In 2004, digital creature work was becoming sophisticated enough to create transformations that could not easily be achieved with traditional makeup alone. The filmmakers therefore combined different techniques. There was still physical performance. There were still practical elements. There was still makeup and costume components. But digital effects allowed the body itself to change. That combination is important because CGI works best when the audience can feel the physicality underneath it. The werewolf cannot simply look like a computer-generated animal. It has to look like a human being becoming one. And the performances help. The actors provide the physical foundation. The effects transform it. That relationship between performance and technology is one of the defining characteristics of early 2000s fantasy cinema. It was an era fascinated by what computers could do, but it was also an era before digital imagery had become so ubiquitous that audiences stopped noticing it. When Van Helsing was released, seeing a full digital transformation, a large-scale supernatural battle, or an entirely computer-generated creature still carried a certain sense of spectacle. The movie takes advantage of that. It wants the audience to look. It wants the audience to be impressed. And it wants every creature to feel bigger than anything that could exist in the ordinary world. This is also why the film's action choreography is so important. Van Helsing does not simply stand still and fire weapons.
We are bound by ancient oaths.
Through environments. He climbs. He jumps. He swings.
We are bound by ancient
dodges.
oaths.
He uses the surroundings. Anna fights with similar energy. The action is designed around momentum. Characters rarely remain stationary for long. A fight begins in one location and spills into another. A chase becomes a confrontation. A confrontation becomes an escape. An escape becomes another fight. This constant motion creates the film's signature rhythm. It also explains why the movie can feel exhausting. There is very little time to breathe. But the filmmakers clearly wanted the audience to experience the story physically. The film is not asking you to sit quietly and contemplate Dracula. It wants you to run through the castle with Van Helsing. It wants you to hear the werewolf behind you. It wants you to watch Anna leap into danger. It wants you to see Frankenstein's monster dragged into a machine. It is spectacle as storytelling. And when spectacle serves the story, the movie becomes genuinely exciting. The problem appears when spectacle replaces story. There are moments where the film introduces another creature or another visual effect because the movie seems almost afraid of becoming quiet. That is where some emotional developments feel rushed. The relationship between Van Helsing and Anna could have been deeper. The tragedy of Velken could have been more sustained. Dracula's psychological motivation could have been explored more. Van Helsing's forgotten identity could have become an entire mystery. Instead, the film repeatedly accelerates toward the next set piece. This is perhaps the most revealing limitation of Van Helsing.
We are bound
it has
by
enough
ancient
ideas
oaths.
for several movies, but it wants to fit them all into one.
We are bound
Dracula,
by ancient
Frankenstein, werewolves, vampire brides, the Vatican, Van Helsing's identity, Anna's family curse, romance, comedy, action, science, religion, immortality. The film is practically overflowing, and yet, strangely, that overflow is part of its charm. You rarely watch Van Helsing and wonder whether anything is going to happen. The question is usually what ridiculous, spectacular thing will happen next. That makes it a fascinating time capsule of Hollywood's early 2000s blockbuster mentality. Studios were increasingly willing to spend enormous amounts of money turning established properties, classic characters, and genre mythology into visual spectacles. The Lord of the Rings had demonstrated the power of large-scale fantasy. The Mummy had shown that monsters could become action-adventure heroes. Underworld was combining vampires and werewolves for a darker audience. Sleepy Hollow had demonstrated the appeal of gothic atmosphere. The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen had already attempted to combine famous literary characters into a shared adventure. Van Helsing belongs to that same broader cultural moment. It was a period when Hollywood was fascinated by the idea that familiar genre icons could be modernized without losing their recognizable identities. The result was sometimes brilliant, sometimes strange, and sometimes both. Van Helsing is perhaps most interesting because it sits directly between horror history and blockbuster future. It looks backward to universal monsters. It looks forward to interconnected fantasy franchises. But it does not completely belong to either. Its Dracula is not Bela Lugosi's Dracula. Its Frankenstein monster is not Boris Karloff's monster. Its Van Helsing is not Edward Van Sloan's Professor. Its werewolf is not simply the tragic wolfman of the 1940s. Everything has been redesigned for a faster audience. And that is why the movie feels so distinctly like 2004. The pacing, the CGI, the costumes, the action, the humor, the giant sets, the aggressive score, the mixture of practical effects and digital creatures. Even the idea of turning a gothic monster hunter into an action franchise protagonist feels unmistakably tied to that era. But while the movie is fascinated with modernizing old monsters, it never completely abandons their emotional foundations. Frankenstein's monster still wants acceptance. The werewolf is still a man trapped by a curse. Dracula still represents the terror of immortality. The Gothic castle still represents isolation. The family curse still represents inherited responsibility. And Van Helsing still stands between humanity and the supernatural. The movie has simply added guns, explosions, and a lot more movement. That is why it remains watchable. There is a kind of generosity to the filmmaking. It wants to entertain. It does not pretend to be smaller than it is. It does not apologize for its ridiculousness. And it understands that monster movies have always depended partly on visual imagination. The classic Universal films had limited technology, but they created monsters through makeup, lighting, sound, and performance. Van Helsing has vastly more technology, so it creates monsters through digital effects, elaborate sets, practical work, choreography, and music. The tools changed. The fundamental attraction did not. People still want to see the monster, and they want to see what happens when the monster meets another monster. That is the simple pleasure underneath the movie's enormous mythology. Dracula versus Van Helsing.
By ancient oaths.
Vampires versus werewolves. Humans versus monsters.
We are bound
Science
by ancient
versus
oaths.
superstition. Life versus death. And eventually, monster versus monster. Because the story is moving towards something even stranger. Van Helsing will become a werewolf. That sounds almost like a joke when described outside the context of the movie. The monster hunter will become the monster. But within the logic the film has established, it makes perfect sense. The werewolf curse is dangerous. It is also powerful. And Van Helsing is going to need that power. The transformation will become the final irony of his journey. He has spent the entire movie using knowledge of monsters to protect humanity. Now he will have to use the monster inside himself to defeat another monster. The question is whether he can control it, and even more importantly, whether he can survive it. Because a werewolf is not simply stronger. It is a countdown. The curse has a time limit. Once the transformation begins, the human being risks disappearing beneath the creature. That makes the final confrontation a race against time as much as a battle. Van Helsing will have to defeat Dracula before the werewolf curse consumes him. The hero's own body will become the weapon. And that is where the movie's theme of identity comes full circle. Van Helsing has spent the entire story asking, implicitly, who am I? The answer is not going to be simple. He is Gabriel. He is Van Helsing. He is a hunter. He is a man. And for one crucial night, he is a werewolf. The film is preparing to turn his greatest fear into his greatest advantage. But there is another reason that transformation matters. Dracula believes himself to be beyond nature. He has escaped death. He has rejected human limitations. He has built his existence around supernatural power. Van Helsing, by contrast, is going to embrace a curse temporarily in order to protect others. The distinction is subtle but important. Dracula uses the supernatural to dominate. Van Helsing uses it to sacrifice. That is the moral difference between them. And sacrifice is about to become central. Because Anna's family has already paid for its war with Dracula. Velkan has paid.
We cannot wait any longer.
We must reach the throne before dawn.